A few days ago, I made an episode about Ohio State recruiting and how Ryan Day just being open and honest about his monetary needs for name, image, and likeness deals to keep his roster together, and how Ohio State still being active in recruiting and being in there for some of these bigger high-profile prospects like Brandon Innes, Carnell Tate, etc., is just really giving them a lot of momentum. It's keeping them in the loop. They're not falling behind in recruiting at all. And I didn't make an episode about these two teams either, but James Franklin just talked to reporters the other day and basically mentioned the same thing in regards to NIL, that his program needs the same amount of money as Ohio State if he wants to compete with the likes of Ohio State, which I thought was a very wise and intelligent thing to say. And then there's Michigan State. Michigan State, I don't know if they're necessarily on the same NIL platform or level as an Ohio State or Nebraska is, but they seem to be pursuing it and going about NIL and recruiting in the same way that, let's say, Penn State is doing, where they're trying to be adaptive and they want to be competitive with these bigger schools. That's Mel Tucker's goal, obviously. That's why it was extended for 10 years for $95 million. And they're recruiting at a higher level than they've seen before under D'Antonio. They currently have the 14th recruiting class nationally. Ohio State is the 5th highest ranked recruiting class, and Penn State is 3rd. And in the Big Ten, Penn State's 1st, Ohio State is 2nd, Michigan State is 4th. So where's Michigan in all of this? What is up with Michigan recruiting? Because to me, looking at everything, it's summer visits, and this is the time where typically, along with the fall, that Michigan recruiting obviously has an uptrend to it. We saw this last year where recruiting also looked dead in the spring, early summer. It began to pick up during parts of the summer. It really picked up when Michigan football started to win games. But at the moment, it's pretty silent. Michigan is the 31st recruiting class nationally, and it's 8th in the Big Ten. Michigan recruiting is at a point where I think that they need to do more if they want to keep their top 10 classes. And by more, I mean take NIL more seriously. And it seems to be the case that they have. I mean, in the past 2 weeks, they finally allowed student athletes to use the Block M, the winged maze helmet, and J.J. McCarthy and Hunter Dickinson regarding basketball, and Blake Corum, and a lot of athletes have gotten NIL deals, but there's still no NIL collective. And Jim Harbaugh's most recent quote about Michigan football being a transformational, not transactional experience, which I'll read about that in a few minutes, reinforces, I think, the attitude that Michigan is taking toward this. I have no problem with the quote. In fact, I think that what would be Michigan's ideal initiative with NIL would be making these massive offers, using their massive resources. I mean, U of M has some of the most resources in the nation, probably only second to USC. Honestly, if you just look at total money, I know that by football resources, they're not always talked about as this big bag of resources, but that's mainly because Michigan doesn't always look at football the way that they necessarily should, and they do have other priorities. Whether you agree with that or not is different, but the reality is that likely none of us watching this video have any influence in how Michigan spends its money. And they have other priorities, like being the #1 public university and being more focused on academics and other things. For whatever reason, and this saddens me as a football fan, they don't always take football in the most serious manner. Well, for me, what would be ideal is if the transformational, not transactional quote was paired with, again, massive NIL deals, an NIL collective that is constantly offering these kids out of high school money, but the message to still be, you're coming here, to help build a winning culture, to help build something that can be a force nationally, not just in the Big Ten, you're not only coming here for money. Because that's the last thing I want for Michigan. And this probably won't happen because, again, not prioritizing football over other things. But look at a school like Texas, or maybe even Texas A&M, or some of these other schools that are really pushing this. Like they're towing the line in reality because they are so close to almost being open about just paying players that if the NCAA had any power, they'd be taking a huge risk. But the NCAA has no power. So that's why Texas A&M, Miami, Texas, USC get to hand out these $1 million plus NIL deals to some of these higher profile kids, like what just happened with Jordan Addison. But I don't want Michigan to not necessarily become like them, because I think at places like USC and Miami, I would say, the feeling of the coaching staffs and culture around there seem to be good. But the last thing I would want for Michigan is to be all on the money, not on the culture, because that also gets you a bad result. You need to be balanced. Often going in the middle of the two extremes is the way to go. And with NIL now coming around in recruiting, one extreme is just purely developmental, that you really don't care about recruiting. You know, kind of like Mark D'Antonio, for example. Kirk Ferentz would probably be the most modern example, more developmental than trying to get these high-profile kids. It's like the most conservative way to recruit. Or you can be all in, all aggressive, which is going all in on the money, all in NIL and stuff. And maybe you can still develop, but maybe you don't either. I think those are the two extremes now. And it's certainly widened the range of outcomes regarding recruiting, and it's certainly going to help the rich get richer, which is why Michigan here has a huge opportunity with it. But that was just me wanting to talk about NIL and my own opinions on how I think it's negatively affecting Michigan recruiting. Michigan does have a lot of high-profile visitors, and we will talk about this in a few minutes during the month of June. Several June visits where several kids are visiting Michigan. Caden Proctor is visiting in the fall on Saturday, September 3rd for the opener against Colorado State. So we're not going to be talking about that. We're just going to be sticking to the June summer visits. But before we get into that, I want to talk about specifically what Jim Harbaugh said in an article by mlive.com. And then after that, we'll get into Michigan's 2023 recruiting class and the 2023 football visits. So this article is titled Michigan Football Recruiting in NIL Era, quote, transformational, not transactional, which again, with the lack of an NIL collective and these bigger deals, especially being offered to high school kids, this quote is only going to be likely further used against Michigan football in the recruiting aspect. Again, not saying I disagree with it. I agree with the quote. Doesn't necessarily mean that it was the best thing to say given the current circumstances. On a day when Ohio State coach Ryan Day stood in front of a Columbus business leaders and matter-of-factly threw out dollar figures that he believes his football program would need to retain players in the future, Jim Harbaugh was in more familiar territory. The Michigan football coach and several members of his staff appeared at a football camp at Ferris State University on Thursday. I believe P.J. Fleck and James Franklin were there as well, mixing with high school prospects and area coaches in order to find the next player. But recruiting these days has become a more high-stakes game, as I just mentioned before, one that before the NCAA allowed players to profit off their name, image, and likeness was a more linear decision. Less than a year later, the height of the culture wars in college football has to do with, quote, collectives, groups of rich boosters pooling their money together in an organized way for players at their respective school. Once again, Michigan does not have an NIL collective. They have an NIL organization, but they don't have a specific collective where the boosters gather pools of money and basically hand it out to players, because that's what they do. Anyone else saying otherwise, it's just facts. The debate played out publicly just a few weeks ago when we know Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher just went after each other, and Jimbo Fisher denied paying players. In reality, I do genuinely believe he did. It just depends on whether it was the way that the NCAA has allowed it through NIL deals, or whether it's just like straight up paying them. And with just the amount of loopholes, there's probably no way to prove that it was illegal. And even if it sounds illegal, it's probably legal with the amount of loopholes that the NCAA has left over. Harbaugh said that he hears a lot about the NIL bidding wars and such. He doesn't know how accurate some of it is, if it's just stories. Harbaugh has been fully supportive of NIL rights for student athletes, saying that a player deserves to be compensated for the sale of their jersey, which will be huge, especially for Michigan with their name brand. Michigan athletes, through the Valiant Management Group and other third-party deals, have been able to make money from many different sources. But like Harbaugh's skepticism of some of the high-dollar amounts, NIL's broader effect on recruiting very much seems in flux. Less than a year in, the NCAA has already issued guidance saying it would begin to crack down on inducements made to attend a school, although ramifications of such a move is dicey. And I don't even know if ramifications of such a move will happen. I don't, because again, the NCAA really doesn't have a power. Harbaugh said, right or wrong, our philosophy coming to Michigan is still going to be a transformational experience rather than a transactional experience. By all accounts, there is no collective made up of Michigan boosters, leading some to wonder if the school might be falling behind when it comes to landing high-level recruits. Well, we may not know the answer to that for a few months, if not years. I think you'll know sooner than later, just seeing the massive, the changes that have already been seen. Like Tennessee, all of a sudden, in the top 10. I would say it's pretty much the same thing with Texas A&M landing their number one recruiting class. And Oregon just went through a coaching change. I know it's a young hire in Dan Lanning, who's a very good DC, which is new, young, risky hires are always going to be attractive to recruits. But just the amount of high-star guys they're in the running for, totally involved with NIL. Totally. You cannot convince me otherwise. And it's a legitimate question if Michigan is lagging behind. So that's basically the article. Again, I will link it down. I'll link it down below so you all can read it. And now we will get into some of Michigan's visitors for this summer of 2022. First and foremost, we have defensive lineman Jason Moore. Jason Moore is visiting Friday, June 17th, and he is ranked 52nd nationally. He's listed as warm toward Michigan, as most of these guys are, according to 24/7 Sports. Michigan does not have a lot of commitments on the D-line. They have Brooks Barr, who's also visiting that same time. He's a 3-star, ranked outside of the top 500, and it's pretty much a similar story for a lot of these guys. At linebacker, you have Jaden Ausberry, number 69 nationally, who's a 4-star. He is visiting as well. You have Raylan Wilson, who's already been committed to Michigan, though recently, according to insiders, he's leaning toward Georgia after his Georgia visit. I think just this past weekend. Correct me if I'm wrong. But Raylan Wilson, huge part of the recruiting class. He's currently the highest ranked player. Again, Michigan's recruiting class just being so low is, for a lot of these positions, it's important that Michigan makes moves and puts an impact on these guys. And I think that this staff can certainly do that. But again, NIL is just so important. And another factor to mention is just Harbaugh going to the NFL. His contract and his buyout don't necessarily suggest that he's going to be stopped from doing that in the future, what he did just earlier this winter. And that's also being used against him on the recruiting trail. Plus, Harbaugh's a known. Even though he just broke through last year, he's still more of a known than an unknown. He's not necessarily young. And like I said earlier, these riskier, younger hires, which a bunch of them just took place, Oregon, Notre Dame, so like at higher profile schools, Texas, even though Steve Sarkisian is in year 2, I would say just Quinn Ewers going there, along with Isaiah Nayor and others, just make that also a destination. Also, just because it's Texas. USC as well. I mean, the coaching carousel was crazy. Absolutely crazy. And it put a lot of these younger, more charismatic, better recruiters at more higher profile universities. Also, Miami being back, being invested. The recruiting trail because of NIL has only gotten tougher, which is going to make it harder for a lot of these players, whether offensive, defensive, players in general. It's going to make it harder for them. It's just going to make the decisions even harder. Safety Makari Vickers, 85th nationally, is also visiting, along with defensive back Jacoby Johnson, who has experience at wide receiver. He's listed as an athlete, number 87 nationally, and he's visiting as well. I think it'd be cool to get a player who is versatile, like how we're going to use Mike Senra still this fall. You also have defensive lineman John Walker. John Walker is visiting June 10th, number 97th nationally. He's from Florida, and he's also listed as warm, as most of these guys are. Again, now we're going to get to the offensive players. Offensive players, you actually have a 5-star here. You have Jonte Cook. Jonte Cook, 5-star wide receiver. He's from Texas, DeSoto, Texas specifically. And Jonte is visiting Monday, June 20th. He is listed as warm. We're going to talk about him just a little bit because it's a 5-star wide receiver. You don't see this often from Michigan. He looks like he has 3 official visits scheduled. One to Oregon on June 17th, which is just exactly a week from today. He already visited Ole Miss on June 3rd. He's visiting Michigan June 20th. In his scouting report, he's listed as 5'11" and a half, 171 pounds, with a well-proportioned body structure, muscular build, can continue to add weight and strength, more than ample arm length and wingspan that is an asset for him with regards to catch radius. Good burst off the ball, gives him an advantage on most defensive backs. Excellent quickness, change of direction, agility. His short area quickness is an asset when he's running pivots or in or out breaking routes. Nice at sinking his hips, which again, very important to have that hip control for wide receivers. Jamison Williams, Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, great examples of that if you ever want to watch like film on elite wide receivers. Those 3 are examples of guys that know how to use their hips to manipulate defensive backs, because that's what defensive backs look at, or good defensive backs are taught to look at when reading a wide receiver. Is able to adapt to running the route tree from both the slot or outside receiver position. 2-sport athlete who also competes in track and field, like another Michigan 5-star Nicholas Harbaugh, who does not have an official visit from what I can tell, but is still very much in the running to commit to Michigan. He had 806 receiving yards in 2021, 19 receiving touchdowns. His career stats are 29 receiving touchdowns, almost 1,500 receiving yards, with 81 receptions. He is listed as warm toward Michigan, Ole Miss, Oregon, Florida, Jackson State, Texas, and Texas A&M. It'd be a huge pickup if Michigan can get him. Hopefully Ron Bellamy and the Michigan staff get an absolutely huge impact on him and boost his interest in the program. Up next, you also have offensive tackle Charles Jagusha, who is number 55 nationally, offensive tackle, and he is listed as warmer. He's from Allenman, Rock Island, Illinois. He's listed as warmer specifically toward Michigan and Notre Dame. He's also listed as just warm toward Arkansas and Missouri. Seems to be a pretty heavy Notre Dame lead at the moment, but he's still visiting Michigan, so that's a good thing. Running back Jeremiah Love, number 72nd nationally. He's listed as an athlete as well, but listed primarily as a running back when you click on his profile on 24/7 Sports. Tight end Luke Haas. He is visiting June 10th. 82nd nationally, currently an Arkansas commit. So we'll see how that ends up if he decides to switch. Again, I'm not a huge recruiting guy by any means. I just see what I see and tell you what I hear, but I'm by no means a recruiting insider. I'm just telling you what I see. Offensive tackle Caden Green, number 92nd nationally, is also visiting. And then tight end, another guy who's listed as an athlete in Jackson Howard, number 96th, nationally. So Michigan, 1 5-star visitor, a plethora of 4 stars. And this, again, is just what's scheduled at the moment. Like Caden Proctor is visiting September 3rd. You have other guys, like I anticipate that Nicholas Harbaugh will visit at some point. And Michigan's still in the running for plenty of highly talented, highly sought-after recruits. So there is hope. There is hope that Michigan can jump from what is right now the 31st recruiting class, and that some of the guys they're in the running for, they could still get a top 10 class very easily. But there is work to be done. The staff knows it. Obviously, any staff in the country knows that with recruiting. Any great staff, at least. There is always work to be done on the recruiting trail. Michigan is loaded with visitors who seem to be favorable towards the program, and I can't wait to see how summer recruiting goes. I'm hoping personally as a Michigan fan that it goes really well, that we get some big-time recruits. And it seems that a lot of other Michigan fans and Michigan insiders, who of course are the guys we should be listening to, seem to also have some positive insights on what summer recruiting at Michigan will look like. And that's really all I have to say for this video. Michigan recruiting and their involvement in NIL seem to be lagging behind a plethora of other programs right now. Hopefully they can catch up, especially in the NIL aspect, as that will help them a lot in the long term. But there is optimism, there is hope, and is evidence, not a ton, but there is enough evidence behind both to suggest that Michigan is certainly going to bounce back and do well. Like I said earlier, last year for Michigan started off pretty similar. Then when the summer came through, they picked up some momentum, and then when they started winning games, in the fall especially, that's when the momentum really rolled. And then there was obviously, the signing period where Darius Clemens got picked up along with whatever his name is, defensive lineman Moore. I forget his first name, it escapes me, but 2 really good players Michigan picked up. Derek Moore, 2 excellent players that Michigan picked up right before finalizing their recruiting class. That's all I have to say for this video. If you liked it, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on Michigan recruiting in this video down in the comments below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys around. Bye.